Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of CIO Leadership Live. I'm Mary Fran Johnson, the Executive Director of CIO Programs here at IDG, and I have the great privilege today of speaking with Jim Rinaldi, who is the Chief Information Officer of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. For the last 13 years, Jim has been the CIO at JPL, which is a federally funded research and development center that is managed by NASA for Caltech. It is one of the world leaders in space and planetary exploration. Jim is responsible for all of the IT systems and the infrastructure, providing enterprise services, high-performance computing, and unique support to the scientific and project communities centered on JPL. Imagine having a user base where you've got more rocket scientists and PhDs running around than regular people. That's Jim's world. Of the 600 people that run IT under Jim's command, about half of them are outside contractors and partners. Now, before he joined JPL in 2005, Jim was the CIO at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, and before that, the Chief of Information Technology Services for the IRS. Prior to his federal government roles, he was in the private sector as a Senior Vice President of Information Resources, Operations, and Services at Marriott International, where he spent 16 years in various management positions. Jim, welcome. It's great to have you here today.
Well, thank you, Mary Fran. It's great to be here and look forward to our discussion.
I do too. I always have such a great time when I talk to you, and I always learn stuff. Let's start out by talking about JPL's IT organization and how it is set up and structured, and especially how it's been evolving in these last few years of dramatic change in IT.
Well, it's been a very interesting journey for us. We tend to, and I tend to organize based on need from year to year, and we've been through some changes over time. So we have a fairly traditional model in the sense of we do major system development. We are end user driven in terms of that. We also are consultative, which is a major emphasis for me. Mm-hmm. We obviously manage infrastructure, networks, and services like that, and operations, and then you're very aware of our big thrust always is on making sure IT stays current, and we manage our ability to look at emerging technologies, and we're organized to do that so that we can be prepared for whatever the next wave and how we can apply that if it applies to JPL.
Yeah.
Cybersecurity is also a very important part, and that's always a continuous challenge, and it's one where we in the lab have put resources into it. So we have good talent, and we're always growing our capabilities in that area as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know when we talked earlier, you mentioned that there's definitely some shadow IT throughout JPL. Yep. So you've got IT around that doesn't necessarily report to you, yet it's still very much working as part of your team. So I don't hear very much about collaborative shadow IT. So tell me how that works, and how did you get it to that stage where it was really part of the team rather than something that was a problem for you as a CIO?
Yeah, it was a journey again, but it was building trust. I'm careful about looking like we're building an empire here. So it really is what's the best way and the most effective way to get IT done, and some of that requires having IT resources where the need is, and having that. I'm going to say business, but having that non-IT trust with an IT person, even if it's theirs, mm-hmm. and creating that environment where they feel like we're supporting them, not competing against them.
Yeah.
And that was a challenge. That took a few years to get through that. And so inviting the shadow out of the shadows and into the party mm-hmm. Is a challenge. And it turns out from a career development, people are recognizing and have recognized that that's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
And then getting the CIO support on some initiative that is important to whatever the particular group is, it turns out to be advantageous to those groups. So it's win them over, and then all of a sudden they see career, and 9 times out of 10 they end up wanting to be a part of us.
Yeah. Well, and I've heard that from other CIOs when we've talked about shadow IT. They've said that it's great to have your own, essentially they can become very big fish in a little pond, but then they don't have any way to get out of the pond. And
Right.
that getting together is a good approach to it. You mentioned the other business units. Of course, when we think about regular private, like insurance and companies and banks, you think there's operations and distribution and there's marketing and all. But JPL has some very unusual business units. I mean, you've got people working building spacecraft, for instance. So when you
Well,
talk about the rest of the business at JPL, what are some of those departments and divisions that you have that we wouldn't find in an ordinary private enterprise?
so let's from our programmatic side, or the side that does missions, we have so it's pretty unique. We have one that's called the Mars Directorate. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, how many people are going to have that? Or Earth Science Directorate,
Yep.
or Solar System Directorate, Deep Space Network
Yep.
Directorate. And so, it really identifies some of the uniqueness we have because of the missions and the type of missions we have.
Mm-hmm.
Astrophysics Directorate, that's one of my favorite. And so, IT is somewhat aligned to that while we're providing a lot of, common services. We
Yeah.
also provide unique services to those organizations because their needs are really quite different from each other, because their missions are quite different from each other.
Mm-hmm.
We actually have a discrete manufacturing system, but we really don't manufacture in quantity. It's more like quantity one at
Yeah.
a time.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of fun to talk about that a little bit because of the unique nature of the missions we have.
Yes. Well, and let's talk a little bit more about being a federally funded R&D center. You have to plan a little bit differently because the way NASA funds, it gets funded in like a 3-year cycle. So what kind of impact does that have on the business you run as the CIO?
So what it does, it's a little certainly different than the government does it. But what we tend to break it down is we know what missions they want to fund and what work that NASA wants us to do, and then we partition the money off. So there's a piece for IT, a piece for HR, a piece for business services like facilities and things of that nature, and so. In effect, it becomes like a tax on our missions. At the same time, it's necessary work that it has to be done. So, and then we do it on an annual basis. We do a 3-year lookout to see, what the environment's going to be and what missions we'll be doing in the subsequent years. Missions take a long time to do. Certainly, the planetary missions do, and so that requires us to plan not only our budgets, but certainly the workforce, that's required during those times. And IT is a part of that. We have to plan our workforce too, which then obviously impacts the budget process so that we can meet the requirements. Usually in a 3-year window in terms of planning, but certainly on an annual basis in terms of budget.
Mm-hmm. When you think about all the different projects and the things that are funded and underway right now, do you have one that is a special favorite? Something where you're just more interested in that particular mission than any others? I know whenever we get together with your chief innovation officer, with Tom Soderstrom, we end up talking about robots and things like that. So I just wondered if you had, I know you love all your children equally,
Yes.
but I wondered if there's any that particularly just really strike a chord with you.
I have to tell you, we have something we call quarterlies, and where I get to meet with all my folks who are doing project work for us, and I get excited about all of it. I have to be honest with you. My excitement goes 8 to 10 hours, so I can't get enough of it, and so I really don't have necessarily just a favorite. I have some that I pay particular attention to. And we're doing something pretty exciting with that I think will positively impact our friends in the federal government, in that we use multi-factor access, and we're working with a consortium of companies to make your smartphone part of that multi-factor, so that instead of putting a smart card into your computer, you'd walk up to your computer with your smartphone and it would recognize you and you put in your code and you're done.
Wow.
And that so far has we've been able to get that working, and we're soon this year we'll hopefully be deploying that. There's some obstacles to go over, but it's kind of one of my favorite because it grabs people's attention. It sounds kind of innocuous in terms of an IT project, but in reality, we have to use our badges to get to our computers, and if we can do it, it lessens that one little factor. Guess how many lost badges we won't have?
Oh.
So
you'll have people hugging you in the elevators.
Yes,
over this
that is exactly right. And I will tell you, there's not a better feeling than when a scientist hugs you.
I guess you're right. Yeah, that would be pretty special. One of the things that we talked about, I always have discussions with CIOs about their customer base and, the internal versus external customers. You've got quite an extensive customer base. In fact, you said you think of them more in segmentations rather than the way, a typical CIO might in a private enterprise. Explain a little bit about that.
So the way we do our planning, we look at our customer base in terms of, for an IT planning, what is the individual needs? Because there's a lot of very smart individuals who work differently than others. There's the team. So we look at it from a team point of view, which sometimes is organization view. Mission view, so how many people are on a mission? Missions need unique IT sometimes, and that's different than, say, what an individual needs or a team needs. But one that's, and then of course institution, which is sort of the enterprise, what's the enterprise view. But if you look at where I'm really differentiating is now in communities.
Yep.
And there are communities of customers here that really do think alike and that, leverage each other. And if we can supply the IT for that community, so an engineering community is going to be different than, say, a business administration community, or than maybe an HR organization or something like that. And when you have these communities and you can gear your IT so they can be the most effective they can be, I think the lab benefits from that productivity and that type of use of IT. It is a challenge, though, because if you look for efficiency, it's not the most efficient model. But if you look for effectiveness, I think that more clearly outweighs the things that might drive some inefficiency.
Yeah. And what is it that makes a group like that a community versus just a group of employees?
Well, it could be scientists across multiple disciplines. So you might have radar people, you may have chemists, you may have astrophysicists. They tend to look at things differently, but they also talk to each other and work with each other. And the fact is, they may need, a type of IT. Say for example, in high performance computing, if we gear our resources so they can use, that specialized type of computing, we're doing that community a great service. One recently over the last few years we did was the software developers across the lab. We generate a lot of software at JPL, and it rides on spacecraft. It does Earth type science as well. And when we create this community working with our other partners, and it's sort of centered around, say, GitHub.
Okay,
and
I remember that.
We found sharing that we've never seen before, and so we had a great advantage with that, and I'm actually very proud of that because it sounds so simple, but it turned out to have great benefits, and we're seeing a really transformation in how we do software development now.
And I remember reading things about GitHub. It was a much bigger deal a few years ago. And of course, like so many things in technology, it becomes part of the fabric and nobody talks about it anymore. But explain briefly for the few listeners like me who don't remember exactly what GitHub is.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So it's an open software capability that for source code storing and management, and it turns out it has a very cool interface and a very easy way for people to share and find and share source code so that and other objects that I might add that allow them to not have to redevelop what's already been developed. And it takes people out of their silos. This is why I like the community thinking.
I see.
You're tied to an organization, but that's not how you always work. And in a matrix workforce, which we are, you may find that there's horizontal lines that go across the matrix that have more interest together than, say, vertical lines.
Right. Okay. Got it. Let us switch gears to talk about the initiatives you have underway that would fall under the very popular buzzword these days, digital transformation. What does digital transformation mean for an organization like JPL when, in fact, everything you do has been digital pretty much for a long time? And I remember when we were getting ready for this interview and I asked you about it and I said, is this kind of a silly question for you? And you said, no, you have digital transformation stuff underway. So talk a little bit about what that means for JPL.
So it really does mean that we want to not necessarily challenge what we do, but change how we do it. And how we do it is, can we do it in a more streamlined manner, a more collaborative manner, where it's more data-centric manner versus process-centric manner. You certainly need the processes, but you build those processes around what's the data that people need to do their job and interact with each other, and instead of building a process and then figuring out how you manage the data. And one of the things that's been fairly successful for us is opening up the data. We tend to be, when we do our missions and projects, they tend to be a little mini silos, some of them quite large. And that means the data gets locked up too.
Yes.
And so if you change and work on a different mission, you may not be able to get to that mission you were just on and access the data.
Right.
And so we've been able to work with our components in the lab to open that up, and that's transforming how we work as much as anything, because now people can get at things that they couldn't do before because of a siloed approach instead of a collaborative sharing approach. Now, it took technology to do that, and so we have a very talented search team. We developed using open source software. We developed our own search. And that search turns out to be a very important component of our transformation. It's not a Google search, it's a how do I find things in JPL? We're a quite complex organization.
Yes.
And if you can find things without having to know the organization to go ask, I think you're going to work a little more effectively in your job.
Interesting. Well, that's what you mean because when I asked you this before, you said, well, it's really a data transformation, not so much digital. I wonder if that isn't true for a lot of companies, because
I happen to think it is. And given my multi-industry background, I think that translates quite a bit across industries and all the colleagues I meet with. So I would agree with you there. It is understanding the data. Now, here's the ironic part. IT doesn't own the data. And so we have to be good stewards of the data and provide a good architecture for the folks who do own the data to be able to see the value in what we're doing.
Well, and you have to be the ones that are kind of keeping watch on the security guardrails around the data as well, I would think.
Oh, of course. Yeah. Yes. I don't get a pass on that.
No, exactly. Because if something goes horribly wrong, they'll come looking for someone to blame in IT. That certainly happens.
It is my responsibility, so I take it very seriously, and it's an important part. And the lab really does treat it with the respect it needs. And I'm very proud of where we are, but we're not even close to being finished.
Well, I liked one of the terms you used. You talked about having data that was the gold source for the other processes and things, and that getting the right access to the right resources, streamlining how you work and all that. How far along are you on that journey?
It's an architectural model that I'm very happy with, and our my strategist and enterprise architect folks have figured out. It's a modernized software development and service development model, and it's not foreign to a lot of people, but it's based on keeping the data where it's best managed and build and have the right kind of middleware in between or messaging in between, and then build the software to access that data as tools.
Okay.
You'll certainly build applications that will manage and maintain that data, but you're also building capabilities that people want to access that data. And we can do with that kind of architecture. We can build software much faster and build services much faster. Some would call it an API model. An API is part of it, application programming interface, and we're seeing a great benefit by having that because of the speed we can go at. Our demand for IT at JPL is extremely high.
Yeah.
And which is a great problem to have. And so if we can then improve our own processes, our own transformation, if you will, then we can help meet the needs of the lab in a much more rapid manner.
Yeah. Is that architecture and some of the work behind it that you're talking about, is that something that JPL might ever make available as a service? Like something that would be an additional revenue stream where you could offer it to big companies?
Probably not. I think we would certainly share the idea and share, how we did it.
Okay.
But no, I don't see that taking away from our main purpose being here, and it really is to meet the needs that NASA has asked us to do.
Well, and whenever I talk with you or with your colleague Tom Soderstrom, we always end up talking about the mission, and it's a lofty thing to be thinking about, exploring the universe, and using IT to do it. Let's talk a little bit about JPL's governance process, because that was one of the things that I found kind of encouraging and surprising, is the way the governance at JPL has IT elements on every single committee involved with it. Explain how that works.
So the lab has several councils that make decisions or make recommendations depending on the type of work it is. It's around what business we do, and what business, what proposals we should go after, what's good, what we're good at. And so there's a strategic council, there's a lab management council, and there's a project management council in effect, so that we have focus on our missions. The lab management council is more what you would call something around a COO model, where you're looking at the operations. And then there's the executive council, which I sit on, and the director of the lab chairs, and it's the highest level council we have here. So those councils offer IT, and we have IT. I'm on all of them, quite frankly, but my deputy is on some of them. And what we do is we're there to represent, but also listen. We take that input from the councils, and then we go prioritize what IT does.
Okay.
And we can bring issues, we can bring requests, and we can certainly get it to the point where we're making decisions about priorities that IT should be going after.
When you think back over the way all of this has been evolving and changing in the last, say, 2 to 3 years, is there a priority in IT now that is much more dominant than it was just a few years ago?
Yeah, I think it really comes around. I mean, there's two. I mean, I can't say cybersecurity enough. So there's always that. Yeah. So, that's kind of a given, but I don't want to make it look too light.
It's always in the top 3. Yeah,
it is. Yeah. I think our what we've seen a shift in is really around the whole data strategy. And people are taking that very seriously. And I would say that's really a great opportunity for us. And and you're right, it does treat our feed, I should say, into the whole notion of the digital transformation. And the lab takes that very seriously. And matter of fact, they've established an office of digital transformation, and that just got established, or is being established as we speak, because it is going to allow us to focus attention on the things that really need to be transformed. And then that's, it's all IT enabled, but it's business driven.
Oh, okay. You probably can anticipate my next question. Who's part of the Office of Digital Transformation? What kind of functions are in there? You don't have to name employees, but
Okay, yeah, I probably shouldn't, but it's going to be someone who has worked a long time in IT,
hmm
who will be driving that. It reports to the deputy director of the lab,
hmm
who effectively is our COO,
yes.
and and it will be able to go across function and cross organization. The benefit to the IT organization is that will help drive priorities so that we're not trying to do everything at the same time.
hmm Excellent, excellent. Our sister research organization, International Data Corp (IDC), has done a lot of work lately looking at different structures around how companies do digital transformation.
Yeah.
And I know that an office of digital transformation is one of the more rare birds that you find. They find 3 or 4 different big types and approaches. I'm going to have to flag this for them because they're probably going to want to talk to you about how
Yeah.
you have it set up. You mentioned, and I don't want to just treat it glancingly either. You mentioned cybersecurity and staying ahead as much as you can in the threat landscape and how that's changed. I know there's a lot you can't talk about around cybersecurity, but I think maybe we could talk about the ever-changing environment and the way the threats are coming from different places, maybe just the way you build resiliency into the organization. Tell us what you can about cybersecurity.
So, the we know where the attack vectors tend to be,
hmm
and we know the enormous amounts of data that we collect around these things,
hmm
and so we feel adding, we are adding and doing analytics on the data much differently than we did a few years ago. So we're getting better informed about what we capture and what we know, and to help reduce the surprises. Now, on the other hand, we have legacy.
hmm
And so one of the challenges for us is to start retiring more legacy and replacing the legacy with more current, systems.
Right.
And that's a challenge, but it's also one that the lab does support, and it requires, that we stay more current. Now, the federal government has asked us to stay more current as well, because that's what they're having to do. And
hmm
so we're aligned with our colleagues at NASA to do so, so that it not only reduce the threat of attacks, but also, quite frankly, it helps us manage the environment a lot better
hmm
so that we know what's going on. And then we use anomaly detection and or behavioral capabilities. We can see when something is not quite correct and go after it in maybe a faster way and a more
hmm
thorough way.
Well, in some of the conversations I've had recently, we do a panel which is a CIO CSO discussion at all of our CIO Perspectives events. And I've talked with a number of CSOs lately, and they're very keen on behavioral analytics, on the
Yes.
different tools, the things that can just spot. And you mentioned them, I guess you called them anomalies, but they're somebody, it's kind of like somebody who's in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah,
Uh,
we're there.
and
We're there.
yeah.
That's certainly in our area of ever growing capability.
Okay. Are there other new or interesting types of cybersecurity technologies to fight some of these problems? Anything that has kind of risen on your radar scope? You might not be using it yet, but you're watching.
So we really think that there's going to be more advantages in the AI ML world
hmm
to help our humans just can't do as much. So
Artificial intelligence, machine learning. Yep.
that's
hmm
exactly right. And so we see that we have to, in fact, do our own digital transformation in that area. And that's pretty exciting because there's so much that we know, and then there's so much we don't know. But having the speed and feed of the automation is
hmm
going to really keep us more informed, and hopefully keep advanced of the threats. And if an attack happens, can we recognize it faster, isolate it, in effect, build that self-defending environment
Yes, the
that
resiliency. hmm
it's still a little bit of a dream, but it's at the same time, I think it's achievable given where the state of the technology is going.
Yeah. What's funny, I've been thinking lately about how often I find myself talking with CIOs about various almost new twists on the whole topic of IT automation. It reminds me of that everything old is new again sort of thing, because I can remember back in the 90s at Computer World talking a lot about automating different processes and this sort of
Yeah.
thing. And what seems to have made it kind of sexy again is all the prevalence of tools built around machine learning and AI and systems that are in production. This is not
I
just
read a lot
playing.
of I read a lot of books about what happened in the 90s, and so what's happening now
Back
is
when you were in college, right?
when I was a mere child about this stuff.
Yeah.
No, I actually, the advent of cloud computing, and we're a big adopter of cloud computing.
Hmm.
It gave us the opportunity to do the DevOps type of,
Yeah.
automation, and you can do the provisioning and the deployment so much faster and not have labor, sitting there doing it. And that's really to match the speeds and feeds of community that you spin up, spin
Hmm.
down,
Hmm.
capabilities. And so in this world of unlimited capacity, unlimited storage and compute, you've got to have the automation to do that. And world-class companies are doing those things, and that really helps us
Hmm.
get the services to the customer faster. And that set of customers that adopt to that are seeing the benefit of getting their processing done in a much faster manner than they could before.
Right.
Instead of waiting on them buying a server, installing the server, those things that now take weeks and weeks could be done in a matter of minutes. But
Hmm.
if you can do it with automation to manage it, including how you charge back on it, how you reduce the risk of runaway things and stuff like that, I think it really allows us to continue to automate more about how we do IT. And I think it's imperative that IT looks at itself that way.
Hmm. Well, and when we think about all of the automation happening and all the, the emerging technologies and the massive change that we have going on at faster and faster rates, all of this, it kind of boomerangs back into what I see as a very changing dynamic for CIOs in terms of what your role encompasses these days. Tell me what you've seen because you've been 13 years at JPL. So when you arrived back in 2005, you probably weren't the IT governance guru strategist that you are today. So talk a little bit about how that role has expanded and how it has changed the IT department.
Well, I think you kind of touched on it earlier.
Hmm.
Having a seat at the table is imperative. To drive the changes that we needed to drive, and in terms of strategy, which I enjoy, by the way, thinking strategically and not just worrying about operations day to day,
Hmm.
because that allows us to plan for the future. And IT is such an enabler of the future that I get that special seat at the table.
Hmm.
I actually enjoy that. And
Hmm.
then we're able to organize ourselves to deliver based on what I come back with and based on what we're seeing from our non-IT components
Yeah.
and what the needs are. So it's very exciting that we can develop our strategy. I do want to add one little thing.
Hmm.
I consider us a business within a business. And so we look at IT to run like a business. What services we offer,
Yes.
we do chargeback here so that we can distribute the costs fairly across the units. And when we do that, that's interesting from a money flow, but it drives behavior. Plus, we can measure better because we know what people want, what the
Hmm.
consumer wants, because they're willing to pay for it.
Right.
And so that part of IT, we run like a business. How we make decisions, I've mentioned the governance process, but how we translate from, planetary talk to
Hmm.
IT is not always, there's no book for that. And
No.
so we have to
Hmm.
develop that translation and that mapping.
Yeah.
And then that goes into our strategic planning process. And then we present that back to the lab at least on an annual basis, sometimes twice.
Yeah.
And so that to me is very exciting, and that's how we've been able to communicate differently to the lab than we could 13 years
Hmm.
ago.
Well, and that's I think of that as a virtuous cycle where you listen, you hear what they're saying, you interpret it in ways that they can understand, and then you kind of present it back to them. You know,
And after 13 years, I'm starting to understand more, and it's kind of scary.
there you go. Well, you get that opportunity to bring them something that they never knew they always wanted.
That's
That's a
right.
I remember hearing that phrase years ago, referring to marketing people and how that was one of their ultimate goals. And I think more and more these days, IT leaders have that same goal. You know,
Actually, you bring up a
Mhm.
wonderful point. I do want to, as part of the business of IT, there is a marketing aspect of IT.
Yes.
It's not selling. It really is making people aware of
Of
what's
your value
available.
and your value.
And
And
that's right.
there is nothing wrong with selling the value of IT. You're
Yeah.
not selling anything down the river there. You're making
I,
people aware.
I think it's an
Yeah.
imperative. And I think otherwise you could easily be treated as a cost center.
Yes.
And then you're always counted on to, reduce cost.
Well, and
When, and
mhm.
my statement is if you invest in us, I'll reduce your cost.
Now, do you have any sort of marketing or communication talent that is part of your IT department that you use to help with that?
I do. I have
Hmm.
a communication, and they help us with our deployments as well,
Hmm.
so that we're communicating. Because change is hard, and IT promotes more change than any other functional organization. And so part
Yeah,
of it is how do you make awareness out there and how people effectively use the capabilities that we might be rolling out or
hmm,
changing.
that's right.
And so the communications. When I first got here, it was kind of funny. We would I said communicate. So we did a lot of communications, and I got complaints that we were over communicating.
Yeah.
And I said, that's great.
Because whatever you retain from that communication, I'm a step ahead.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, and you made a point too when we talked earlier that one of the changes in the CIO role and IT's role in general is that people have become better customers of IT.
Yeah.
That collaboration is kind of working.
Yeah.
It's become a two-way street.
Yeah. And it really is true. I think, people value IT differently than they did not that long ago, but they value it differently. And so if IT invests in helping the customer be a better customer, we all benefit from that. And you can't do it in an arrogant, dictatorial way. You have to do it in a very collaborative way.
Hmm.
And I think we've had, great success in doing that. There's always challenges,
Hmm.
um, but at the same time, I'm really proud that we have a different discussion than we used to have, and that people are generally very interested in what we're doing and how we're doing it, and they're not off trying to do their own thing as much as they used to be.
Yeah. Well, and technology itself has become so democratized. And with all the recent attention on the GDPR, the privacy regulations, and Mark Zuckerberg testifying before Congress and all that sort of thing, it's everybody's much more aware of all the amounts of data that are out there and what's being done with your data and all that stuff. Um, when I think about IT people and talk with other CIOs, we almost always talk about the talent challenges. You're not quite as stricken as some CIOs in terms of you have, because you're associated with Caltech. You're there in beautiful Silicon Beach, and so is it a snap for you to get the talent you need?
Well, it's not necessarily just a snap.
I know
I,
nobody's ever going to say that.
it's we have there's a lot of people who want to work at JPL, and because of what we do here,
Hmm.
and that attracts a very nice set of talent. We get at JPL, we'll have 800 students here this summer, and I get my share. I'll get about 30, 35. And out of those students, they're not all IT people. They're physicists.
Hmm.
They're Harvard students in
Hmm.
business. They're in, MIT, Caltech, and Cal Poly. So I get them from all over, and most of them want to come work for us. So our pipeline,
Mm.
can be, pretty
Pretty
futuristic
richly
because
filled.
they may
Hmm.
not. We want them to obviously complete their education,
Yeah.
and so we don't have quite the issue. Sometimes it depends on the discipline that we're looking for.
Hmm. Okay. Well, let's change from talking about the soft people skills aspects to the hard skills in the network and all. Tell me a little bit about the size and scope of your global network and the parts of it that are actually interstellar. You have a pretty amazing network, considering how some
So
networks can seem a little boring, but yours never does.
no, we our network is also ever changing, and
Mm,
we have multiple networks, and we segment them off for some various reasons, and we invest a lot in our networks because one thing we have is a lot of data and a lot of movement of data,
hmm
and data comes from places that are not natural to a lot of other companies. So,
Right.
we'll have data coming from Mars and from
hmm
orbiters and from Earth's rotating satellites, and
hmm
that data comes through, our networking functions, and then when it gets to the ground, it starts riding my network and or
hmm
networks, and we have to deliver it to the right place. So if you think about today's world, where you have your systems and clouds, you have locations all around, and you collaborate with other space agencies, other institutions. Your network has to reach out to all those locations and be able to make sure that it's providing the services they want.
hmm
So it is a vast and changing, and we're really investing into networks that more like an applications or a set of applications that can change dynamically. And I'm
mm,
excited about that. So you've probably heard about software-defined networking.
sure.
We're really into how we can take advantage of that and still maintain the security and maintain the service levels that we require.
Okay. Um, when I think of other industries, there's always the fear and loathing of getting Ubered, having some sort of disruption come along that really suddenly, it was adjacent to your industry and maybe you didn't see it coming, especially hospitality and retail. There's a high degree of attention and interest paid to that. Um, is there any industry disruptor that you worry about?
I probably should worry about some, but I really think we're pretty dynamic in terms of what we do. The government wants us to do a certain thing, certain types of missions, and we're very geared to do that here at JPL. And
hmm
so getting that type of talent and keeping that talent would certainly be, you know, an issue for us. So I want to say that we should be concerned, and we do look at those kind of things.
hmm
But our overall is be very good at what we do, deliver, and then I think we'll be fine. So last month in May, we had two major launches,
hmm
and we have three spacecraft on their way to Mars. If they do accomplish their mission when they land on November 26th, we're really demonstrating our unique capabilities here
hmm
to meet the needs of NASA and the federal government and the U.S. citizens, quite frankly.
Yeah. Well, do you and the managers and the leadership of JPL, do you keep an eye on people like Elon Musk?
Well, we work with SpaceX.
Mm-hmm.
Matter of fact, the Grace follow-on mission that just launched 2 weeks ago rode a Falcon 9 rocket, and that's a SpaceX rocket.
Mm-hmm.
And so we see them as great partners in working with us and NASA to deliver spacecraft at certainly at a much lower price point. So we see that as an exciting, uh, you know, opportunity, and we've worked pretty well with them. And I think they're a
Mm-hmm.
very creative company, and I know their CIO Ken very well, and
Great.
and I'm always fascinated. I think it's wonderful that they're all in the LA area, and we have the Silicon Beach, and we have JPL, and we have Caltech. Um, we're not we're
You're not.
getting more like San Francisco
Mm-hmm.
and Silicon Valley, and it's very exciting. We just have a more relaxed pace in Southern
Yes.
California than they do in Northern California.
Well, yeah, it's exactly. It never feels quite as cutthroat competitive as some of it. Well,
Right.
because you're doing different kinds of work. You're not trying to create some app.
Plus, we're so worried about how we get through traffic. We don't have time for that.
I guess so. Well, what are some of the emerging tech trends that you have found kind of most useful for your work recently? We mentioned Internet of Things. IoT is definitely, I know, been high on your list for a while.
So we're as we talked about earlier. We look and track these emerging technologies, and we go to CES to see what's hot and new and things like that. And the IoT space has certainly been maturing. So you build sensors to capture data that you couldn't capture before very easily or economically. I'm a big fan, and you mentioned Tom earlier, my CTO. I'm a big fan of looking at other interfaces, and so we're intrigued by the smart voice or the voice activated or type of thing, because keyboards have been around for 50 years, and so people use Siri today or Alexa or Google Home, and that's becoming much more of a natural thing, especially if you're driving or other activities that you need to be focused on. And we've done some work recently with a procurement group here where they can use Alexa to access some data they need. We wrote the code ourselves, and it's protected and all that kind of good stuff. And it accesses certain data that they can ask for while they're working on a procurement on the keyboard. And so, we see that as saving some time. And it's very interesting and fun at the same time, because we see that user interface starting to grow more and more. And I think other companies, I know my friends at Farmers Insurance are doing that kind of thing. And I think you're going to see a whole new skill set get developed around that space. And I find that to be something to keep an eye out on. One thing I'm very high on, too, is the evolution of 5G networking. Yes. I think that is going to be, now this is my view, is it's going to be a game changer, because as much as we're always connected today, we're not quite always connected. There's something that drops us off.
We have the illusion of being always connected.
That's a great way of saying it. Yeah. So in my illusion, I drop off quite a bit. So what I want, though, is, and what I think was going to happen is, that could be a very transformative technology that gives you full-time connectivity, but not just for your human aspects, for your system of systems aspect, so that work gets done differently than before, and that you could count on that type of network speed and resiliency to be there. At least I think that's the promise. We'll see if it actually happens, but I like the fact where it's going.
Yeah. Well, and what you were talking about with voice recognition and voice activated, I think that is such a natural human way to interact with computers. I can remember, this would be 25 years ago now, my son Kai was probably 3 or 4 years old and was trying to play the VCR, because we had a VCR at that time, and he pushed in the tape and then looked at it and then leaned over and said, "Play." And today he's a software engineer at Google. So, I think that there's a lot of this. It just made so much sense to him at the time. And we were so far from that capability then.
But now, if I do the math, at 27, he can actually lean over and say play.
Oh, indeed. Yes. And so, I prefer to text by just using voice activation. It's actually a lot more accurate than trying to swipe or type.
It turns out, with the advent of Slack, the advent of chatbots, we do chatbots here, and we're seeing a growth in that. And then you start merging these technologies together. It provides a new way for people to ask for services, to get things done, much more in a human-like manner, even though we know it's all technology-driven behind it. Now, over time, with the advances of robotics, we're probably going to see a lot more assistants that feel and look like us who will get work done. So I'm very excited. I'm not scared of AI. I actually embrace it. And so I'm looking for the day that I'm surrounded by robots.
Well, and I'm relieved to hear you say that. I think as the CIO at JPL, if you told me you were worried about AI, that would probably be cause for concern. One of the things that we also talked about was about the importance of this changing your mindset as a CIO and the way you collaborate and look for other resources. You used high performance computing was one area you mentioned. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, I think the CIO is not always responsible for building the services. Sometimes it's how do you provide services? And in our case, high performance computing is a very important aspect of computing for a lot of the research and mission and simulations that we do. So I can't always bring all the high performance computing into JPL. And so we work with others to get that access. Certainly we use our colleagues at NASA's Ames Research Center. We use their supercomputing capability, which is much more than we could have. So the strategy we developed was, let's go find how we can get as much computing, high performance computing for our very smart workforce, get it at the most reasonable way I can get it, and provide a local aspect so they can develop their software and get it right here and then deploy it elsewhere.
Okay.
And we found that so far to be very successful. And I think it's a model that, NASA can follow and may follow as well.
Well, and one of the things I always ask CIOs about and talk with them about is what their strategy is in approaching innovation. And I feel a little silly asking you because you do so much of what the lab is doing is very innovative and leading edge, and you're exploring the final frontiers and all that stuff. But companies and organizations often have either a structured or a kind of free-form approach to innovation. So describe what it is you do within JPL.
So we have several ways of looking at innovation, and we certainly do one where employees of the lab, contribute to that and ask us to help them. And some of it may not be IT. I mean, innovation is for a lot of different things. So certainly there are people who innovate in the mission work we do, but also it could be innovation in how we run the lab, or how we do facilities, or how we manage conference rooms and things of that nature. And so we encourage that by having forums where people can submit and get a little bit of money to help us get it done. And those things really work pretty well. We do hackathons internally as well, and those kind of things. But the lab encourages innovation, and we reward that when it's the innovation that has a real impact.
Okay.
And so the lab itself, it's not just IT, embraces innovation in many fronts. And that's what makes us one of the top places to work, is that, we have that kind of culture here at JPL that, one could be very proud of, because of, the unique problems we try to solve really do take innovative thinking and innovative ways to get things done.
Well, and that also, on the flip side of that, that means that you have to have a culture that somehow is supportive of the flops, because you can't get to something innovative without having a certain amount of failure.
Yeah, that's very true. And I think we take a reasonable amount of risk. And we're willing to accept a reasonable amount of risk to try things, and we realize that not everything's going to work. And when that does happen, you still learn from it. And so the learning from it and the exposing it to the rest of the lab to say, we tried this, it didn't really work, educates the rest of the lab. Please don't try this on your own. We've already done it. So.
Do not try this at home for demonstration only. Yes.
It's just not good to do.
Well, when you think back in the last year or two, what is an innovation that came out of IT that you're particularly proud of, or that you want to give a shout out to some of your particular folks about?
Well, I really think, we're doing some remarkable things with, how I mentioned search earlier. It turns out that capability is feeding other processes, so that now people are counting on, a set of services or applications that they may have that now can find data that they couldn't find before through this innovative search capability. And so I'm kind of proud of that. I'm proud of so many different things. And so it's hard for me to just nail one thing down for us, because again, we do so many things in IT from, from the basic, my iPhone better work to,
Mm-hmm.
to how do we support a mission in its preparation to launch. So,
Yeah.
you know, and I get excited, just so you know, I get to sit at a console. Now, they won't let me touch any buttons,
Mm-hmm.
but I get to sit at a console so I can be there listening and watching as the preparation, say, for a launch goes. And when you do that, you really get a feel for how important IT is.
Oh, so cool. Do you get to like wear any special badges or helmets or anything or?
Well, they won't. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's probably several helmets I should wear, but yeah, there's. I get to look important. And I look like I'm pushing buttons, but I'm not.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Right, right, right. I've always maintained that most CIOs have way too much natural modesty. So I feel like I'm all about increasing the visibility of CIOs and making sure that you all brag about some of your accomplishments a little bit more.
I have to tell you on the external side, I do
Mhm.
want to say something. I am very proud of the relationships I've built outside of JPL in the
Great.
CIO community.
Hmm.
I have seen a shift in CIO mentality, respect, that seat at the table, and the desire to deliver services that really matter versus IT that shines.
Yes.
And that's a huge change from not too long ago, but certainly
Hmm.
from the 90s and those times that you tell me about.
Hmm. I know when I was back there working and you were still in college.
Yeah.
Well, and that's a really actually that's a great point to wrap up our conversation on because that's all about leadership and about CIOs coming into their own as corporate officers and true leaders in their companies. So you probably have a few lessons you've learned over the years. You've been in private industry, you've worked, God help you, with the IRS and then the FDA and now JPL. So let's throw out a few. What are some of the lessons you've learned, things that Jim's rules to live by?
Well, yeah, you do. I mean, if you're in it as long as I am,
Hmm.
you ought to learn something. So, so some of the things I've learned is, don't protect or defend what you build. Be ready to disrupt it yourself.
Hmm.
And if you find yourself being defensive, then you probably need to step back and reassess what you're doing.
Don't stand guard on your legacy, in other words.
That's exactly
Hmm.
right, because legacies do change, and,
Yep.
and you can only you're only as good as yesterday, not a year ago or 6 years ago. The other thing is I refresh myself. One technique I really work hard at is, and I do it around the January time frame because it's
Hmm.
New Year's is past. It's new. There's something new, and
Yes.
I come in with a mental thought that I'm the new CIO at JPL.
Hmm.
And the idea there is, what did I inherit from the last CIO, and what would I fix? And if you think about when you change jobs, and you've outlined that I've changed jobs quite a bit, that when you go in, it's very objective. You go in objective, you go in fresh,
Hmm.
and you go in not knowing anything. Now, that's a little hard to do when I come in here, but at
Yeah.
the same time, I look at it as a way of, being that fresh new CIO at JPL,
Hmm.
and what could I do that wasn't done before? And
Aha.
that gives me a fresh sense of purpose and energy, quite frankly, that it drives me a little bit in thinking like that. And then finally, one thing I would offer up is, uh, you know, obviously, by the way, you should always hire good people, and that
Mm.
you
Yeah.
can't do it yourself, so you better hire good people. But the one thing about being a CIO, there's several characteristics. Be a communicator, do some marketing,
Hmm.
and represent your organization and company really well.
Hmm.
So honesty, integrity, all those things really matter. And also show a sense of urgency without a sense of panic.
Mm.
And people
I
will
like that.
respond positively to that.
Yep.
And those are just some of the things that I've learned over the years that I think helped me and I think would help others as well.
Hmm. I love those, and they're very succinct too. Now, when you came in January, this past January 2018, and you pretended you were new, what did you change? When you looked around, where did you see the dumpster fires, as it were?
Well, I found that we were, I came in and looked and said, well, we're not doing certain aspects of our chargeback just right. So let's
Ah,
take a fresh view of that.
mm-hmm,
Let's make sure that we're able to drive down some cost and some rates. Let's look at how, we're doing our cloud processing. I came in and looked at how we're organized. I made some changes around that so that
mm-hmm,
we can meet the needs. Now, I didn't do anything dramatic this year,
mm-hmm.
but I have put an emphasis working with the lab on digital transformation. I used that term on purpose. We weren't using that term a year
Ah,
ago.
okay.
And
Good.
so I've used that term on purpose because you can look it up, you can Google it,
There's
and people
tons of
can
media out there on it, God knows.
and,
Yeah,
and there's not a lot of common definition necessarily,
yeah.
but people can read about it and see what others are doing.
Mm-hmm,
And at JPL, I promise you, we'll do our research and
mm-hmm.
people will look up what is this guy talking about in digital transformation.
Yeah.
And I think they did. And
Well,
so seeing us create an office excites me.
yeah, that is, and that's well, and it's comforting too on the media side to because yeah, I get a little fearful sometimes that we make up buzzwords and then we kind of beat them to death, and then after a while they don't mean anything. And so
Yeah.
to see companies, well, to see organizations like yours actually building an office around a concept like digital
Yeah.
transformation, it gives it more legitimacy than
Yeah,
it might have had otherwise.
I'm sure pretty soon I'll probably have to create an office of blockchain.
Uh-huh.
It's
Yeah.
the other hot topic
I
out
don't know.
there.
I keep trying to find CIOs who will get up on stage and talk about it, but CIOs won't do that until there are results to talk about and real things to show, and nobody's got it. I mean, even big financial institutions are like, no,
Yeah,
no, nothing we can talk about publicly. So
yeah,
I think
it's
we're a
coming.
ways away.
We're a ways away,
Yeah.
but it's coming. I think it's real.
Yep.
I think it'll be here. I'm just not sure of all the applications we can take benefit of.
Okay. Well, and you're in a great position to know and to watch these things. Thank you so much for your time today, Jim. It's been delightful, as it always is, talking with you. And
Same.
I'll look forward to seeing you this summer when, yet again, you come to accept another Innovation Award at our CIO 100 conference in the middle of August.
I'm always excited. I'm like a kid. I love those things, and so you will see me there, and I'll be bright and shiny, waiting for picking up an award from Mary Friend.
Well, and even on the few rare years when you don't win an award at JPL, you're just always there cheering on everybody else too. So it's
I
been
will.
great to have you on today. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yep. Well, thank you for tuning in to another fabulous episode of CIO Leadership Live. If you have joined us late into the broadcast, you will do not fret. You can find it posted by tomorrow on CIO.com. And we also have audio podcasts of my interview with Jim available on iTunes, Google Play, and SoundCloud. And I hope you can join me for our next episode, number 12, which will be Monday, June 25th at 1 p.m. Eastern. I'm going to be talking with Doug Blackwell, who is the Senior Vice President and CIO of Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield of New Jersey. It's been a pleasure having you join us as our audience today, and I will see you next time. Thanks. Okay.